で、まずそれを皆さんに見ていただきたいと思います。
Hello to all of my friends at NEC and my friends in Japan. It's a pleasure to be with you today. I'm going to start on a somber note, and I hope it'll end up being a liberating reflection. You'll have to be the judges. GDP has been slowing all over the world for the last 20 years. And the reason this is happening is productivity has been declining all over the world for 2 decades. The result is we have a lot of structural unemployment. It's especially difficult for the millennial generation and the Gen Z generation. They're having a difficult time finding a place in a 21st century workforce. Our economists are projecting 20 more years of low productivity and slow growth. And let me do the numbers for you. After 2 industrial revolutions in the 19th and 20th century, here's where we stand today. Arguably half the human race is far better off than our ancestors were before we began the Industrial Revolution, granted. I think it's also fair to say, however, that 45% of the human race today, making $5 a day or less, which is the poverty level, are no better off than their ancestors were before we began the industrial age. And while half of us have done much better, the other half of the world has not really improved their condition. The very wealthy among us have done very well. Today, as I speak to you, the 8 richest individuals in the world today, their combined wealth now equals the collective wealth of 1/2 the human beings living on this planet. That's 3.5 billion people. There's something very dysfunctional wrong in the way the human race is organizing the economic relationships on this planet. But now we have a more serious crisis. The Industrial Revolution has really been about a fossil fuel civilization. Over the last 2 centuries, to make this industrial way of life, we went down into the burial grounds of the Carboniferous era from 350 million years ago, and we dug up the dead remains of plant and animal life from way back in that period of history. And these remains in the form of coal, oil, and gas, we use them to create an entire civilization. It's not just the power for our electricity or the heating our homes, our fertilizers, our pesticides, our construction materials, our packaging, our food preservatives, our synthetic fiber, our pharmaceutical products, our power, our transport, our heat, our light, it's all made out of fossil fuels. So what's happened is we built this short-term, very, very wealthy civilization for half the human race, but we're now in real-time climate change. We've emitted so much carbon dioxide from those fossil fuels into the atmosphere that now we are in real-time climate change. And I want to explain what this is to everyone. Climate change changes the water cycles of the Earth. That's what this is all about. We're the watery planet. Our ecosystems have developed and the biology of life based on the hydrological cycle, the precipitation, the water that floats through the clouds and bathes our ecosystem. Here's the problem. For every 1 degree Celsius that the temperature is rising on this planet because of global warming emissions, CO2, methane, nitrous oxide, for every 1 degree that the temperature is going up, the atmosphere is sucking up 7% more precipitation from the ground. The heat is forcing the precipitation into the clouds. We're getting more concentrated precipitation in the clouds and wild, extreme, uncontrollable, exponential water events. Blockbuster winter snows, spring flooding on every continent, summer droughts and massive wildfires, fall hurricanes and typhoons. Our ecosystems can't catch up to this dramatic shift in the water cycle, and they are collapsing in real time. If you are a young person about to go into the workforce, or a parent or a grandparent, I want you to hear this. Our scientists are telling us that we are now in the 6th extinction of life on Earth. Doesn't even make the headlines. Almost no one knows. This is the most important story and the most important moment in human history. There have been 5 mass extinctions on this planet over the last 450 million years. well before humans were here. And each time there was a tipping point in the chemistry of the planet and massive die out of life. 10 million years each time to get new life forms back. We're in the sixth extinction event. Our scientists are telling us we could lose to extinction over half the species inhabiting this earth in the next 8 decades. The last time we had an extinction event of this magnitude was 65 million years ago. This is the lifetime of today's toddlers in Japan and around the world. We are in trouble. And the UN panel on climate change has told us we now have 10 years left to completely reorganize our civilization and to move off a carbon-based society, to have a zero-emission, clean world. 10 years left. This is a massive shift in consciousness, our technology, our economic system, and our governance. So what do? It's clear we need a new economic vision for the world. It needs to be compelling. We need a game plan to deliver on that vision. It needs to be quick in the developing world and the industrial world. We have to be off all CO2-based fossil fuels across entire civilization. And we've got 20 years now to do this. 2040, we've got to be off. So we need to look back and ask the question, how do the great economic revolutions in history occur? If we know how they occur, we'll get a roadmap for Japan, a world leader, and for the rest of the world, so we can traverse a new journey for the human race very quickly. There have been at least 7 major economic paradigm shifts in history. They're very interesting. They all share a common denominator, and that is at a moment of time, 3 defining technologies emerge across a civilization and converge to create a new infrastructure that fundamentally transforms the way society communicates, powers, and moves its economic activity, its social life, and governance. What are those 3 technologies? Number 1, new communication technologies to bring larger collectivities of human beings together in more complex relationships to communicate across their economy and their society and governance. Number 2, new sources of energy and power, again, to bring larger collectivities of people together in more complex relationships to move the economy, social life, and governance. Number 3, new sources of mobility and logistics, so that we can move larger collectivities of people together in very complex societies. When communication revolutions converge with new energy revolutions, in turn converge with new mobility and logistics revolutions, it fundamentally transforms the way society communicates, powers, and moves its economic life, social life, and governance. These infrastructure revolutions also change our temporal spatial orientation. They change our habitats. They change our business models. They change our form of governance. They change our worldviews. I'm going to give you 2 quick examples. First Industrial Revolution, Britain in the 19th century. Second Industrial Revolution, US in the 20th century. The Brits took us into a first industrial revolution with a communication, energy, mobility, and logistics revolution. The communication technology, first, steam power printing. No more manual print presses. With steam power printing, we could produce massive amount of print very cheap. To have textbooks for a new phenomenon called public schools, newspapers, magazines, brochures, and catalogs. And then the Brits laid out a telegraph system in the last half of the 19th century across Britain. Steam power printing for communication and the telegraph, they combine and converge with a new source of energy, cheap coal from the British hinterlands. And that coal was brought up from under the ground by a new invention, the steam power, steam engine. Then they put the steam engine on rails for transportation and logistics, railroads. The coming together of this communication, energy, and mobility revolution took Britain from a small society to national markets, and from an agrarian economy to market capitalism. And it gave us the first industrial revolution. The United States, the second industrial revolution in the 20th century. Again, communication, energy, mobility, and logistics. The communication revolution was the telephone, a huge change in history, instantaneous communication across distance, annihilating time and space. Later, radio and television joined in. These communication technologies in America converged with a new source of energy, cheap, Texas oil. Then Henry Ford put everyone in the internal combustion engine for automobile culture. And then the internal combustion engine was used in rail, inland water, and air for transport. The first industrial revolution in the 19th century gave us urban and dense urban housing and buildings and commercial life. The second industrial revolution gave us road cultures and suburban habitats. And that second industrial revolution took us through the whole 20th century, and it peaked. We know the date. It peaked in July 2008. And if you recall, that was the month where Brent crude oil hit a record spike of $147 a barrel on world markets. And when it hit that record price, the entire global economy shut down because, as I said, everything depends on fossil fuels, our products, our energy, our mobility, our logistics, our communication, everything. So when the price of oil starts to go over 70 or 80 a barrel, all the prices for everything else go up because they're based on, moved by, or made up of fossil fuels. And when the price goes over $100 for oil, the economy shuts down. July 2008, at 147 a barrel, the economy shut down. That was the great economic earthquake and the beginning of an end game for fossil fuel civilization. The collapse of the financial markets 60 days later, that was an aftershock because you couldn't keep that subprime Ponzi market going when the real economy shut down. We are now in an end game of wild gyrations in the fossil fuel industry. It's being turned into stranded assets. Take a look at the fossil fuel industry on world markets. It's collapsing in real time. And where we have fossil fuels being produced, they are in authoritarian or dying states, with the exception of the United States and Canada. So where do we go from here? I'm going to share an anecdote with all of you at NEC and all of your friends. When Chancellor Merkel became Chancellor of Germany, she asked me to come to Berlin in the first couple of weeks of her new government to help her address the question, how do we grow the German economy and create jobs and new businesses? When I got to Berlin, the first question I asked the new Chancellor, I said, Madam Chancellor, how do you grow the German economy when your businesses are plugged into a second industrial revolution infrastructure of centralized telecommunication, fossil fuels and nuclear power, internal combustion transportation? That infrastructure peaked in every single industrial country in its aggregate efficiency and performance in the last 20 years. That's why GDP is slowing and productivity is declining. And I said to the Chancellor, you can have market reform and labor reform and fiscal reform and stimulate all sorts of new startup companies, but as long as they're plugged into that 20th century second industrial revolution infrastructure of centralized telecommunication, fossil fuel nuclear power, internal combustion transportation logistics, you can't increase your aggregate efficiency, your performance, and you will be, if you will, stalled in your economy. So on that first day with the Chancellor, we discussed a third industrial revolution, a new convergence of communication, energy, mobility, and logistics. And at the end of the day, the Chancellor said, Mr. Rifkin, we will have this for Germany and Europe. I have been privileged to advise the European Union for the last 20 years, its leadership, and more recently, over the last 12 years, the leadership of the People's Republic of China. Now we are now working here in the United States. I want to share this with my Japanese friends. Here's what this third industrial revolution is. It's a digital revolution. And I should say there is no fourth, fifth, or sixth industrial revolution. There's just the third. It's all digital. AI, genetics, biotechnology, robotics. It's all digital and algorithm governance. So the communication revolution is the internet. We're 21 years into the World Wide Web. We have 4.5 billion people connected. We have $25 smartphones now with more computing power than sent our astronauts to the moon. So we are connecting the human race with a communication internet. Everyone is becoming part of a global family. And of course, NEC is right at the top of the list as the world leader that has brought us to this new connectivity. And now this communication internet is now converging with a second internet, a electricity internet, where millions of people are now producing their own solar wind in their homes, in their neighborhoods, in cooperatives, in small and medium-sized enterprises, in tech parks, and in large companies. They're producing solar and wind because solar and wind is everywhere, and now organizations are collecting it everywhere. And what they're not using locally, they're then taking that solar and wind generated electricity and they are sharing it up on a digitized electricity internet, sharing it across continents and within the next 10 years, oceans, using the same big data and analytics to share solar and wind electricity with each other that we use to share data, analytics, news, knowledge on the communication internet. The two internets are converging, communication and electricity internets. Now those two internets are connecting with a third internet. That is a digitized mobility and logistics internet made up of electric and fuel cell transport. And those vehicles are powered by solar and wind electricity from the electricity internet that's converging. And those vehicles will be autonomous over the next decade, and they will be managed, those autonomous vehicles, by the same data, the same analytics that we use to manage and share news, knowledge, and entertainment on the communication internet and share solar and wind electricity on the electricity internet. These are three internets that become one infrastructure, a digital infrastructure for communication, energy, mobility, and logistics that takes us into all the new fields like AI and robotics and biotech and all of the other incumbent industries. These three internets, communication, electricity, and mobility internets, ride on top of a platform called the Internet of Things. And of course, I don't have to tell all of you at NEC, you are world leaders in the Internet of Things. We are placing sensors across the entire world, sensors in the environment to monitor nature, sensors in agricultural fields to monitor crops, sensors in factories and smart homes, and smart businesses and smart vehicles and smart warehouses and smart road systems. And these billions and billions of sensors are picking up data moment to moment. Where's that data going? Increasingly to the infrastructure. It's being sent up to the emerging ICT communication internet, the electricity internet with solar and wind electricity, the mobility and logistics internet with electric and fuel cell transport to actually communicate, power, and move society. The Internet of Things is the buildings. It's the infrastructure, the building stock. And of course, Japan has world-class construction industries and companies, so they will be very engaged in this activity. Every building in Japan is going to become a node, N-O-D-E. We'll have to retrofit every building in Japan because climate change is now damaging your infrastructure. We have to make it resilient. We have to retrofit every building so it's resilient to floods and typhoons and droughts. Then every building becomes a node, and each of those nodes, if you will, becomes an edge, becomes a micro power generation site so that you can generate solar on your roof or nearby, or small vertical wind. Every building becomes an edge data center. While we're still going to have fog computing, while we're still going to have cloud computing and centralized data, we're also moving to edge data centers with fog computing because we're going to put down so many IoT sensors, thanks to NEC and other companies, that the data is so huge, we're going to have to somewhat distribute it. So we'll have centralized and we'll have distributed data, and each building will be an edge data center, blockchain, to operate in platforms locally. It also deals with the latency factor. When we put in these edge data centers in the IoT buildings, it means you can more quickly develop data that you need for emergency and crisis situations. Every building also becomes a hydrogen storage battery so that we can store electricity and use it when we need it or send it back to the electricity internet and get paid. Every building becomes a charging station for Japanese vehicles, for your electric vehicles and fuel cell vehicles. Toyota and Honda and Mitsubishi and Mazda, they are the world-class companies that are bringing us fuel cell and electric transport and logistics. All these buildings, which are nodes, that are Internet of Things, connecting our appliances and every device to each other, is a planetary grid. We're essentially creating a global brain and nervous system that's connecting the human race. It's quite extraordinary. The brain is GPS and Galileo, et cetera, these giant satellite systems. And they are timing and orchestrating the nervous system, which is the Internet of Things. We're connecting the entire planet in a social prothesis, if you will, of what every cell and organism is all about. If you took high school biology, you know that every cell and every organism in the world has to have a means to communicate. It has to have a source of energy to stay alive. It has to have a means of motility and mobility for movement. And it has to have a semi-permeable membrane, a skin or shell, to orchestrate its internal world with the external world. These infrastructure revolutions in history are a social prothesis of what every cell and organism has to survive. A means of communication, a means of power and energy, a means of mobility and logistics. And in our case, our semi-permeable membrane is our buildings, our infrastructure. So the third industrial revolution brings the human race together as a single family. On the upside, it's a great leap forward for humanity. We are now bringing the human race together across all the boundaries, and we're starting to see ourselves as a species in a common biosphere world. This is going to help us democratize commerce and trade. Because the fixed and marginal costs of this digital revolution are plunging, it means everyone can potentially engage each other in a more globalized world. We're going to move from globalization to glocalization, meaning every region and every neighborhood and community in the world at cheap, fixed, and marginal cost, with the new technologies brought online by NEC and other companies, are going to be able to engage each other and create all sorts of blockchain platforms for commerce and social life. That's the upside. The downside of this digital brain and nervous system that's connecting the world is the dark net. How do we assure network neutrality when everyone's connected around the world? How do we make sure that no one is left behind? How do we make sure that countries don't interfere in the elections of other countries already happening? How do we make sure that large internet companies don't monopolize all this data and then commercialize our personal experience in order to return their revenues? How do we protect privacy and data security? How do we prevent cyber terrorist attacks? This is the dark net, and we're going to have to spend as much resources and human time and energy politically in providing the regulations and the safeguards to ensure the black net and the dark net does not prevail. But let's assume we can do that. Here's the advantage of this digital third industrial revolution that brings together IA and robotics and the Internet of Things into a planetary embrace. Let's say you're a small or medium-sized corporation in Japan, or cooperative, even a big company. You can go up on this Internet of Things platform already, and you can get a transparent picture of all the data going through the system. Most of it's free. And you can take the data you care about for your business in Japan, and you can mine that big data with your own analytics. You can create your own algorithms and apps so that you and your business can dramatically increase your aggregate efficiency at every conversion across your value chain, plunge your fixed cost and marginal cost, and bring back revenue. At the same time, you plunge your carbon footprint because we take our systems and our companies off a carbon-based civilization with solar and wind electricity. Some of the marginal costs in this new digital infrastructure for civilization are becoming so low, it's forcing a change in the capitalist system, the business model. I taught at the Wharton School's Advanced Management Program, our CEO 5-week program for 15 years, executive ed. And I always told our CEOs, you want to be able to put in new technologies that can decrease the cost of your goods and services so that you can sell more products and bring in consumers and taking back a little profits to your investors. So we always teach that marginal cost is the optimum market. It's just that none of us ever expected a revolution, the digital revolution, so powerful in its ability to reduce the marginal cost that your margins began to shrink and your profits began to shrink. When that happens, we have to shift from a traditional capitalist system based on exchanges in markets to a new system based on providers and users in flowing networks. Let me explain. When the marginal costs get very low and your profit margins get low, Capitalist markets are too slow. They're exchange mechanisms. You have a seller, you have a buyer, they come together, they exchange goods and services, and then it's over. In the downside, you have to still pay your workers and your warehouse costs and your insurance, etc. So that's where you lose. But at low marginal cost, you can't afford an exchange economy. We are moving from markets to networks, from exchanges to flows, from sellers and buyers to providers and user networks, from ownership to access, from GDP to quality of life indicators, from productivity to regenerativity, from externalities to circularity. This is a huge shift because at low marginal cost, in a provider user network that's a platform, there's no downside. You're always continually, as a provider, providing the service to the user 24/7. So even at low marginal cost, the flow of the traffic is uninterrupted. You still make a profit. But some of the marginal costs in some goods and services are getting so low, it's leading to near zero marginal cost. That was in my last book before the Green New Deal. And when you get to near zero marginal cost, we see the beginning of a new system called the sharing economy. It's a commons. It's a great commons of the 21st century. We now have millions of young people who are sharing their own news blogs at near zero marginal cost. They're sharing their own music. They're taking massive open online college courses taught by the best professors and getting college credit at no cost. They are contributing to Wikipedia, fifth largest website in the world. This website only costs $50 million in donation, it's nonprofit. And the entire human race is now working with each other to construct the knowledge of our species. It's extraordinary. None of what I've just said is in the GDP. This is the sharing economy. This is a new commons. Now, we saw how the sharing economy began to be an important force when it came to news, entertainment, knowledge. But certainly there were some big companies as well that benefited by the sharing economy. But also a lot of it was off the books, not in the GDP. We did not expect the sharing economy, this commons, to move into the physical world. But now that's happened, and that's what I relate in the new book, The Green New Deal, and a zero marginal cost society. We now have millions and millions of cooperatives, local neighborhoods, homeowners, and businesses who are producing their own solar and wind at near zero marginal cost. The sun doesn't send a bill. The wind doesn't send an invoice. The fixed cost of solar and wind have plunged, and the marginal cost is near zero. So we now have people sharing their own solar and wind, and what they're not using in the commons, they're sending back to an electricity internet and selling on the market, and now the networks. We also have millions of young people who are in car sharing networks. These are provider user networks. The providers buy the service, and the users are sharing the vehicles. We have young people that are engaged in all sorts of sharing economy initiatives. They're sharing clothes, they're sharing their homes with others, etc. So this is a big leap forward. And the sharing economy is the first new economic system to enter the world stage since capitalism in the 18th century and socialism in the 19th century. It's very interesting because Japan has a history of the commons. Japan's was a first mover, if you will, in which local communities and regions began to share their resources in collective arrangements. And I should also say that Japan is the home of cooperatives. You have agricultural cooperatives and commercial cooperatives and housing cooperatives and all sorts of cooperatives, which are shared commons. And you have shown the world that it works. Cooperation works. That's one of the reasons Japan has become a world power, not well known in the West, but it's your shared cooperatives tradition that has made you such a powerful leader. And it's also allowed each of your communities to have self-sufficiency. So what we're seeing now is the emergence of a new sharing economy, but it's also going to change the business model. And let me talk about that for a moment, where we're going. I'll give you an example. I worked on moving the transition in Germany out of fossil fuels and nuclear to solar and wind. And back in 2010, the large electricity companies there asked me, well, what do we do now? Where do we go? And I had a debate with the president of E.ON, one of the great electricity companies back a decade ago, and I said, look, you're not leaving the second industrial revolution tomorrow, but it's over. Why am I saying it's over? And I want to share this in Japan right now with you. Last year, we knew this was coming, but last year, 2019, the levelized cost of utility scale solar just dipped below the cost of all other fuels, and wind as well. That means solar and wind, as of today, as I talk to you in Japan, is cheaper, the levelized cost, than nuclear, coal, oil, and liquid natural gas. The market is speaking. This is an extraordinary movement. Several weeks ago, an American solar and wind company capped at a higher cap than Exxon for the first time in history. That's amazing. So what we're facing here is interesting because let me talk about Japan. Japan is the largest importer of liquid natural gas in the world. Third largest economy, but you are the largest importer of liquid natural gas. 1/3 of your power for your electricity is coal. So you are in a very difficult problem now because the market has just put solar and wind below the cost of the other energies. And that means you're facing stranded assets. And I want to be very clear what this is all about. Back around 2015, Citibank, the great bank, they issued a study which was alarming. They said it looks like we're sitting on $100 trillion of stranded assets in the fossil fuel industry, the largest economic bubble in world history. Why, they said? Because solar and wind is becoming cheaper and cheaper. And that was 5 years ago, and pretty soon they'll be the cheapest. Well, they are today. And they said that means that the amortization of fossil fuel and nuclear power over 30 years will not happen. They are turning into stranded assets. You'll never pay back the investments of whatever you're putting online now. So what that means is all the fossil fuels that will never be taken out of the ground or from the ocean floor because solar and wind are already cheaper. It means all the pipelines you put in that will never be used for liquid natural gas because solar and wind are now cheaper. It means all the petrochemical plants that will not be used and all of the industries that are tied to fossil fuels. So this is a real wake-up call. In the last 5 years, over $11 trillion of investment in fossil fuels, 11 trillion, have flooded out because they don't want to be stranded with investments that will hurt their beneficiaries. And interesting enough, this exit from the fossil fuel industry, this is important to Japan, is being led by pension funds. I say this because Japan, your pension funds in Japan is the largest pension fund in the world, 1.5 trillion. And what's happened is the public pension funds, New York and London and Berlin and Melbourne, they're all getting out because they don't want their public employees, their teachers and the police and their city employees, they don't want them to be stranded with their investments not worth anything. So trillions of dollars have flooded out of the industry because the market is speaking. And this means that Japan, which is the third largest economic power in the world, is in trouble on one hand. But on the other hand, you have opportunities. And let me explain what those are. You have, in the second industrial revolution, Japan led the world in aggregate efficiency. Let me explain this. Aggregate efficiency is the ratio of potential to useful work in every conversion across the value chain. It turns out that America, when it began the second industrial revolution, around 3% aggregate efficiency in 1908. We got up to about 14% aggregate efficiency by the year 2000, the ratio of useful and potential work in every conversion. Germany got up to 18.5% aggregate efficiency. Who led the world? Japan. 20% aggregate efficiency, the ratio of potential to useful work in every conversion across the value chain. Japan has shown it knows how to address these issues that deal with climate change. Then you have world-class companies, some of the greatest companies in the world. You have NEC, Sony, Fujitsu, Hitachi, Toshiba. These are great companies that actually understand the digital revolution, understand how to put in this great infrastructure that ties together digital communication, digital electricity internet, digital mobility internet, the Internet of Things. Then you have the world's great auto companies. You have Toyota and Honda and Mazda and Mitsubishi. So you have both the industry experts you need for the communication ICT internet, NEC is a leader. You have what you need for mobility and logistics with your great auto and transport companies, and you have your great electronics companies. Your electricity companies in the 19th century with coal, in the 20th century with oil. And now these are stranded assets. And if you do not move quickly to establish your electricity internet and move to solar and wind, you'll be in trouble. I have here in front of me the University of Stanford and the University of California, Berkeley's world study on solar and wind availability in every country. Let me say what it is in Japan. Right now, today, you could produce 86% of your power by solar and 9% by wind, almost 100%. The rest tidal and biofuels right now. So here you are importing liquid natural gas, largest importer in the world, and your power is coal, and you obviously must understand that the new economy we're moving into, solar and wind are cheaper. Now, there is discussion in Japan about moving to hydrogen. That's fine. I wrote a book called The Hydrogen Economy in 2000, and I was able to talk the European Union and Germany into moving on hydrogen research. But there's different ways of getting hydrogen. Hydrogen is not clean if you take it from coal. Hydrogen is not clean if you take it from liquid natural gas. Hydrogen is clean if you take it from water. So we got to be clear when we talk about being a hydrogen economy, and Japan would like to be a leader, ask the government and ask industry, are you talking about hydrogen from coal, natural gas, or renewables? If it's from the first two, you're still in the 19th and 20th century. I'm very hopeful about Japan. I think that Japan has a long history of cooperatives, a long history of a commons, where you've learned to share your economic life with each other, a long history of that kind of participation. I want to end by talking about pandemics and climate change. I need to tell all of you that this COVID-19 is not a one-off, one-century pandemic. We've had 5 major pandemics now in the last several years, Zika and Ebola and swine fever. And the reason we're having these pandemics, they are related to climate change and to development. When my parents were born in 1908 and 1911, 88% of the world was still wild. Today, only 22% of the world, the planet we live in, is still wild. The rest is developed by human beings. So what's happened is, as the wilderness has diminished, the animals are migrating and closer to our urban environments. And the viruses are hitching a ride on the animals and moving closer and closer as climate refugees, moving closer and closer to human civilization. Viruses rule the world. Viruses are very important in biological evolution. So as we diminish the wild, we're going to have more pandemics as viruses hitch a ride to animals and come closer to humans. And then we have climate change, the floods, the droughts, the wildfires, which are undermining our ecosystems. Again, the wild animals are migrating, and with them the viruses, as these great climate disasters occur continually throughout the year. So we're going to have more pandemics and more climate change. What does this mean? We have to shift to a more resilient society. And we're going to have to learn to live both virtually and physically. There will be periods of time where everything is all right. We'll be outdoors. We'll be living our life. Then a new virus will come from a pandemic. It'll force us indoors for a year or two until we develop a new vaccine. Then we'll be able to come outdoor again for many years at a time. This is not going to go away until we rewild half the planet. And we're going to have a serious discussion about how we rewild half the planet while our population diminishes at the same time. This means that the 3.0 resilient infrastructure is critical. It's a digital infrastructure that connects the whole human race, both virtually and physically, so that we can have a mobility of being indoors and outdoors for periods of time, so that we can maintain our resilience in an increasingly climate changing world, in a world with pandemics. This is the reality, but I'm I'm guardedly hopeful, and I will end with why I'm guardedly hopeful that we can make this happen. But it's a huge task. We're at a turning point, and Japan's going to have to lead as the third major economic power, and as the one nation that's shown us how to deal with aggregate efficiencies over the years. Japan has to lead. We in the United States laid out the entire first industrial revolution in 30 years, from 1870 to 1900. We put in a telegraph system across the U.S. for communication, a continental railroad system across the United States for transport. We laid out and distributed 10% of the public land so people could have homes and communities. We put in universities across the United States, public universities, to train an industrial workforce. We did that in 30 years. Second Industrial Revolution, 1908, Henry Ford put out the first Model T. And between 1908 and 1929, we put out millions of vehicles. We laid out road systems. We put in electricity across the urban areas and telephone lines. We put in pipelines and gas stations. We did it in 25 years. This third Industrial Revolution 3.0 resilient society can be done in 20 years. I have a global team, TRR Consulting. We work with the major Fortune 500 companies across mobility, electricity, and logistics. We've done our own studies. We are on the ground. And we have come to realize that this revolution can be done in 20 years. We can lay out a convergence between the ICT communication internet, converging with an electricity internet, converging with a mobility and logistics internet, overlaid on an Internet of Things building stock, and we can make it across oceans and across the planet in 20 years. We can do it because the money is there. All the money that's flooded out of the fossil fuel civilization, trillions of dollars, can be invested in green bonds. And I should say another strong point for Japan is green bonds. Your pension fund, the largest pension fund in the world, is investing in green bonds. The money is there. We also know that for every dollar we invest in this new 3.0 infrastructure, this New Deal, Green New Deal, we'll bring $3 back in GDP. And we'll create the millions and millions of jobs and new businesses that have to build this infrastructure and create this new world that we so desperately need at this point in time. Let me end by talking about the Green New Deal. I wrote a book, The Green New Deal. It's out in Japan now. As I said, I've worked with the EU for the last 20 years. And our new plan in Europe is Digital Europe and New Green Deal. Two plans melded into one. Digital Europe is the 3.0 infrastructure I just laid out on communication, energy, mobility, and logistics atop an IoT building stock across the planet. The new Green Deal is the various programs, policies, initiatives to move us to zero emission with our new business models and to create the new resilient jobs to address climate change. So I am moderately hopeful, but let me say one more reason why I think we may be able to accomplish this task, but I'm not sure. Our young people, the Gen Zs and the millennials. In the last year and a half, the young Gen Zs and millennials, they left their schoolrooms, the Gen Zs, millions of them, in 3 different student strikes. They called it Friday for Futures. Millions of young Gen Zs went out of high schools, onto the streets in 141 countries in the last year and a half. And their older brothers and sisters, millennials, joined them from their businesses. And they called for a global climate emergency. And they pleaded for a Green New Deal. And what's interesting about these protests, they're not like any other protest we've ever had in history. We've had protests all through human history, social grievances, tribal wars, political wars, territorial wars, but this is different. This protest, which was global in 141 countries with millions of young people, they were coming on the streets and they were seeing themselves as a species. All the old boundaries, the borders, all of it gone. They began to see themselves as a species in danger. And they began to see their fellow creatures as part of their evolutionary family. And they began to understand that the biosphere that we all live in is our indivisible community. And they're not giving up their national ties and their religious ties and their economic ties and their community ties, but they're beginning to see themselves as a species in a world they're connected to with all of our fellow creatures, our ecosystems in the biosphere, which is our indivisible community. This is a huge shift in consciousness. This allows us to begin to think that it's possible that we can relearn how to live on this planet. And here's the cruel lesson of the pandemics and climate change. What we're learning is we were never autonomous individual selves. We were never, each of us, an island to ourselves. Everything each of us does in our lives intimately affects someone else. Every single movement of every day, how we use our products, how we consume, it affects other humans, other creatures, the planet. It's our carbon footprint. We need to begin to think not as an autonomous self, but an ecological self. And here again, Japan can lead the way. There's a long cultural history in Japan and across Asia, where you have a different idea about human beings' relationship to the earth we live in, different than the West. In the Western part of this planet, we have been living on the Abrahamic religions. And in the Abrahamic religions, it says in the book of Genesis to human beings, God says to Adam and Eve, you shall be the masters of nature. You shall have dominion over the plants and animals. They're here for your use. And so we can understand the world we now have today, where we have literally decimated the planet we live in for our short-term benefits. In Asia and the Eastern religions, in Japan and China, India, you always believe that human beings in your philosophy and religions are not separate from nature or detached from nature or masters over nature, but rather human beings are part of nature. And all of your religion and philosophy in your cultural DNA says that all of us as humans have to harmonize our relationships with the rest of the living kingdom and the earth that we live in. We are not masters of nature. We are one among many agencies of nature that have to work in sync with each other. I believe the 21st century will be a century where Asia will help the West understand these lessons. It's imprinted in your cultural DNA. And I think that gives me hope as well. So my message here is we have great global companies like NEC that are at the forefront of a Green New Deal. They are at the forefront of a shift into a digitally connected world where the human race can come together in a more localized pattern and begin to have a more democratized approach to economic and social life. So whether it's NEC or whether it's your other global companies, you have a responsibility here to move quickly. We have to move from pilot projects to massive scale up. So what I would suggest in Japan with the new government is you have to move from pilots to complete scale up this infrastructure, and you have to move quickly. Each of your regions in Japan should be establishing roadmaps for deployment of this digital IoT infrastructure tomorrow morning. And Japan should set up the codes, regulations, standards, and incentives at the national level to allow the regions to begin to move quickly on this infrastructure transformation. I believe Japan can lead Asia and the world into this new 3.0 third industrial revolution infrastructure, this Green New Deal. And so I would encourage all of my friends here today listening to me, please, we need your help. We need your expertise. We need your long cultural tradition of commons and shared experience. We need you to help us, and we help each other, to create a more empathic, a more sustainable world, so we can learn to live with each other and our fellow creatures in this beautiful earth in tandem, in cooperation, on a shared commons. This planet is and should be a common shared by all creatures. Last thought. One thing I know at my age and at this time of life is how wonderful life really is. It's a miracle in the universe. We look out there in the stars, we send our satellite probes, we see just dead universe. This precious thing we call life, which we barely understand, we have a responsibility to generations not yet here. And all of our fellow creatures who have a right to their journey and their sojourn on the planet, we have the responsibility now to transform the way we think, transform the way we act, so that we can become good stewards, so that we can learn to harmonize our lives with the spheres that we live in, the atmosphere, the biosphere, the hydrosphere, the magnetosphere. This relationship, this interconnectivity will be essential. We want to make sure that future generations of life across all of our species borders have their journey, have their moment to experience this miracle called life. Thank you for allowing me the time to be with NEC and all of the friends of NEC. I hope we move toward a Green New Deal in Japan that will lead the world forward to a sustainable future. Thank you.
はい、皆さん、リフキンさんの基調講演どのようにお聞きになりましたでしょうか。横にも出てましたけど、4つの論点でお話をされたかなと思います。で、マクロに言うとやっぱり限界費用がゼロになっていく中で3つのインターネットを結合したスーパーインターネット基盤を作っていく。その中でコモンズっていうような概念で新しい社会を作っていくっていうのが大事だっていうようなことを言われてたかなと思います。で、一方でですね、時間があまりないっていうようなことも言われていましたので、その辺のところは結構考えなければいけないかなと思います。それから今日の議論に関係するところで言うとですね、日本の特徴っていうようなこともあるんですけども、社会における人間的要素という意味では日本が長く培ってきたコモンズの文化、それから自然と共に生きる東洋の思想っていうのがあります。生態系の中での人間ということを考えないといけないっていうようなことを言われてたかなと思います。それと関係するところで言うと、やはり若いジェネレーション Z の人たちが、私たちとは違う感覚でやっぱり次の社会を考えているというようなことを言われてたと思います。それでこのリフキンさんの講演と我々がこれまでやってきた有識者会議、その中での論点を少しまとめてみると、リフキンさんもですね、講演の中で、地球上の人類っていうような表現されてましたけど、人類共通でウェルビーイングな未来を作っていくっていうのが一つのターゲットだとしたときに、一つは開かれたプラットフォーム、技術をちゃんと哲学を持って使いながら開かれたプラットフォームを作り、これがスーパーインターネット基盤ということなのかもしれませんが、これをコモンにどうつなげていくかということ、それからやはり市民の力を中心に、多様な人材がコラボレーションすることで、社会を作っていくことになるわけですけども、その中でやはり人が持つべきもの、哲学とか倫理観とか人間力っていうのがあって、こういったもので、次の社会が作っていけるのではないかということです。最初に出した図に戻りますと、この縦のところ、これは今日の論点ですけども、今みたいな話で言うと、一つの仮説としてはコモンっていうのをどう考えていくかっていうのと、人間力をどう見ていくかっていうあたりが議論かなと思います。そういった感じのところの議論が今日できればと思っています。私からは以上です。